So, hello and welcome to Cultivating Conversations podcast. I'm Steve Collins from Chaseman Global, and today we're joined by Yasir Khokhar from Connecterra. Yasir is the CEO and co-founder of Connecterra and has joined us to share with us his insights from the ag tech sector, share the journey that he started at Connecterra, and share his advice for agricultural technology startups right now. So, Yasir, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. And let's jump straight into it, shall we? So, first off, could you please tell us a little more about you and your background, and give the listeners an insight into you?
Sure. Thanks for the intro, Steve. Right. So I'm the co-founder and CEO of Connecterra. We are a startup scale-up based out of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. About 34 people operating in 14 countries now. And well, the story of Connecterra and my personal background is it's an interesting story, I guess. So I don't come from the ag industry. I spent 11 years at Microsoft. Technically, this is the third company that I founded. I started my first business when I was 16, back in the mid to late 90s, sort of capitalizing on the what eventually became the internet and the dot-com bubble and bust. I guess I like building things. I'm a software engineer by education. And my first company was doing a lot of e-commerce work. The second one that I started right after that in the early 2000s while I was in college was working in the space of interesting computer vision. We were doing sentiment analysis for television stations, and it was kind of my first introduction to machine learning, and AI didn't really exist back then. Did that for a couple of years, learned some interesting, valuable lessons, life lessons, etc. And then joined Microsoft based out of Dubai, where I was there for about 10 years or something, 9 to 10 years. Was eventually bored of the desert and decided for a change of scenery, moved to the Netherlands. With Microsoft, I was heading up their Office division for Western Europe on the consumer side, and ended up living on a dairy farm. And that's a long story how that happened. But it's kind of where these two ideas that I had came together for Connecterra. And in my career at Microsoft, I'd done quite a bit of work around technology as well. And back in 2007, I'd authored the company strategy for smart cities. And that was my first introduction to IoT and sensors. Again, IoT wasn't a thing back then. And this crazy idea that was knocking around in my head was if you could put sensors in the real world everywhere, and then you could use machine learning to understand what the interaction was between different physical objects. Could you make a model of the real world and then be able to predict or at least understand what is happening in our physical world? And this was really looking at, could we use this to solve problems of consequence? And at that point, I was kind of looking for, I had a hammer and I was looking for a nail, so to speak, right?
Okay.
And I was talking to my neighbor, the farmer, and I had a friend who had just quit investment banking and started a dairy farm. And they kept telling me to look into agriculture. And when I had a look into it, I was just absolutely blown away by the scale of the problem, the what we call the agriculture problem, where essentially it's an optimization problem. You need more food, you have less people coming into agriculture, and we need to change the way we farm. And that was sort of a really ideal problem to solve with this concept of data and sensors. And that's how Connecterra came into being. And that's how I got into Connecterra. At least that's the genesis story.
I guess that's the only kind of concept that you can maybe trade the desert and find the nail that you were looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So, and
Yeah.
obviously, Sad is the co-founder there. How did you meet Sad, and how did your paths cross with Sad?
Sad and I know each other for 24 years. We were in college together, and we'd sort of done a lot of our senior year projects together. So we've been good friends ever since then. And when I had this idea, I called up Saad and I was like, "Listen, I've got this crazy idea, and we could just start working on this on weekends." And I'd sort of met him in Seattle. He was also at Microsoft, based in Redmond, and he was totally game. And initially, this just started as something that we were tinkering with, and this was way back in 2013.
Okay, fantastic. And as you know, we at Chaseman, we love Connecterra. We have the cow with the collar on our wall. So if you could share a little bit with the listeners the beauty of the product and how it solves the issues that you mentioned earlier, that'd be great.
Sure. So, I mean, I'll go back to the problem statement, and it's a fairly well-known problem statement now, at least. But here's a little bit of more context around it. So, first of all, world population's growing, and that's a fact. And by 2050, 2060, we're going to hit peak population. There are some projections that say it's going to start tapering off after that. But the next 20 to 30 years, we're heading towards peak population on the planet. And in order to sustain that population, in order to sustain food production, we need 60% increase. At the same time, we're losing labor, depending on which area you're in. And dairy farming, you have a lot of farms that are simply closing down, while cattle populations are remaining fairly steady. Less and less people and less knowledge is staying within the industry. And due to climate change, it's changing not just our growing patterns, it's also having an impact on the planet. Agriculture is a fairly climate intensive activity. So with Connecterra and our product IDA, what we're looking at is how do you optimize the farm for efficiency, for sustainability, and not just the farm, but how do you optimize the entire value chain? And in order to do this, you need high quality data. And that's kind of where the whole sensor story comes in. We built the sensor because we needed a high quality data source. And one of the key sources for the dairy and protein industry is the dairy cow. So you need to instrument the dairy cow. And that's why we built the sensor. But that's not the only data source. We now integrate with about 15 different farm management systems. We integrate with third-party data sources. And IDA is an intelligence. We are building an intelligence that is learning how to operate sustainable farms and efficient farms by using data from several different sources. And the beauty of the product, I guess, is in the impact that we've had. With Wageningen University, we've been running a 3-year study on the impact of our technology in farms, and we've reduced antibiotic usage by 50%. We've improved efficiency by 20%. We've reduced labor by 20%. And these are pretty big numbers for a tech that's just about 3 years old. And we're very confident that we're going to be able to improve upon not just these numbers, but even more.
Fantastic. So fast forward then a few years, and obviously you've won awards for innovation, you've achieved your funding milestones, you've hired some great people. What's the vision for Connecterra next? What do the next 5 to 10 years look like?
So there's The ultimate vision of Connecterra of Connecterra is to empower farmers and to make the agriculture industry and to make farming efficient. And that's sort of our ultimate vision. And we're making those steps starting from dairy, and hopefully we in the next 5 to 10 years we expand into other subsectors of the industry as well. And we're very mission driven as a company. It drives a lot of what we do. It drives a lot of our decision making, and empowering the farmer is really top of our list. And as you see farms getting bigger, and as you see the need coming from consumers to get more insights into how food is grown, um, you will see us working more and more towards having sustainability angles into IDA and how we can help transition the industry using data to identify and implement practices that make farming more sustainable and more efficient.
Okay, fantastic. So I guess that brings us nicely on to my next question. Then obviously agriculture in general, and of course livestock farming, are seeing huge pressure from an environmental perspective. What are your thoughts on the relationship between climate change and agriculture?
Well, agriculture is the most impacted industry from climate change, and it's um, it's a serious problem. Climate change on agriculture. Um, there's also an issue around how much does agriculture contribute itself to climate change, and those are two different problems. And I think we need to box them separately. One is how are food growing patterns changing because of climate change? That's one big problem because it has an impact on food safety and food security for governments and for us as humans. And as a species, we don't survive if we don't have food. And then the second is, well, is the activity itself impacting climate? And that's a complicated one. It's very easy to ignore a 12-cylinder gas guzzling car and point a finger at a cow and say, well, the cow is the problem. Whereas if you look at the data, the real problem is energy. Yes, agriculture does contribute, and livestock in particular is about 14% to global greenhouse gas emissions, according to the latest results. Um, there is room for improvement, but what you see in livestock farming specifically is that the emissions are actually methane. And methane it lasts for about 10 years in the atmosphere. And if you keep the livestock population constant, the methane levels remain constant because of the way that you'll have cows that are born, cows that will die, their emissions go away. And over 10 years, you actually get a net zero effect. So the key trick over here is to ensure that we don't add a lot more to the livestock population, and we can make it more efficient to meet with the demands that we're going to have of food production. The second thing is a new concept called regenerative agriculture. And while it's new, it's being adopted by a lot of the big companies in this space, like you have Danone, for instance, that's launched farming for generations. You have Arla, you have Nestle, all looking at this aspect because livestock actually helps you make your soil and your land um, better. And it also helps you sequester carbon from the atmosphere and store it into the ground. Now, these are new concepts. They are still being studied and tested, but they are promising. And we believe that livestock can actually be a part of the solution. And finally, there are companies that are doing some amazing work around looking at diet that goes to livestock that can help reduce the methane and enteric fermentation emissions that you get from livestock.
Fantastic.
And finally, just one little point that I would add. You also need to draw a distinction between beef and dairy. And those are, again, If you look at the total livestock population, including beef, we've got about 1.3, 1.4 billion cattle. Dairy is about 300 million. And there is room for us to improve across all of these sectors. But consider that they're also part of the solution.
Of course. And so it would be fair to say then that you've started Connecterra at a time when climate change is top of everyone's agenda. How has that influenced your decision making? You mentioned mission driven. How did that influence the ideation and you now when you're looking to raise funds?
Mm-hmm. I think it. So we've had this embedded in our mission from day one. So I wouldn't say that it's the rise of climate change conversations over the past 2.5 years has fundamentally changed or impacted our mission. We've been on this for a couple of years now. In terms of funding, obviously we've attracted impact investors like Pimbamek into Connecterra with a strong focus on sustainability and climate change. From a funding point of view, I think it's a little too early to say because the time horizon to see results on climate change and the fact that a lot of the work that's being done is still in early stages. I'm not sure how that fits with the life cycle of a lot of funds. There are, however, a lot of funds coming up. There is money going into this space, but it's still early stages there. I think we've been fortunate that we've been one of the earlier companies looking at this space, and we already have some results to show.
And that brings me nicely on to my next question. Again, it's almost as if you read my mind, is it? As a CEO of a successful startup in the ag tech space, what's been the key to your success or the keys to your success, would you say?
Oh, that's a good one. So I think the team makes a huge difference. We have a very strong team at Connecterra, and I think every time that we've gone through funding rounds, we've had great feedback on the team. So tech in ag is not new. Ag tech is new. And I think a lot of the tech that has existed in the space has been built from within the industry. And we came from outside the industry and looked at it very differently. I think that the team and that perspective has been one of our key success factors. And that led to another interesting, I think, success factor for us is that we had no notion of what was difficult or easy in the ag space. And as a consequence, when we approached the problem with IDA, for instance, I'll give you a simple example. The industry talks about data. Everybody's talking about data, and they've been talking about data for a long time. And there's this idea that more is better. And we came and looked at it and said, actually, more is not better. In fact, no data is great. So when we built IDA, we actually took away all of the data for the end user. We crunch a lot of data. We're an AI company. We have guys with PhDs and data science and AI and stuff. That's a core DNA of the company. But there is no data in the product. So simplifying the product for the end user so that it becomes usable is a tenet that we brought in from the tech industry. And I think marrying the lessons that we learned from tech, bringing them to ag, and then using the latest and greatest technologies to deliver that to the end user, having key success factors. And then finally, I would also add, we've also been fortunate and we've worked very hard to get marquee customers in early stages. So with Danone, we've been working with them now for about 3.5 years. Has also been a very good validation of what we do and how it's helped us successfully raise funds.
Fantastic. And obviously, it's all been paying off because earlier this year you've had a really successful fundraising round.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's no mean feat, of course, and can be an incredibly stressful time. So, what was it like for you, and what advice would you give to other leaders going through a fundraising process right now?
Don't fundraise in a pandemic. I guess that's that's my like first advice. If there's a global pandemic, I mean, just find another time. Um, so yeah, I mean that said, oftentimes you don't have a choice. And I think we found ourselves in that space as well. Is we were fundraising, and then the Corona crisis hit. And frankly speaking, I think the first wave, which happened in March, was the worst because nobody knew what was going to happen. Nobody knew how bad this was going to be. Um, so it was a tough time for everybody, and I'm really proud of my team that we were able to successfully fundraise despite an apparent global meltdown. Um, Look, for fundraising in the ag tech space, it's not easy because there's not a whole lot of specialist funds, and depending on what industry and sector you're in, um, your funding strategy changes. So if you're a marketplace, for instance, and you're working in the ag tech space, it's a little bit easier because a lot of the VCs and investors can relate to marketplaces. Sure, you're working in the agriculture space, but you're a marketplace. But the more specific you get towards farming, um, the avenues for fundraising then become slightly more complicated because you have less and less specialists in specific sectors and specific types of farming. And your best friend is execution. So if your numbers and your execution can talk for themselves, um, then that's an easy story to tell as well. And we're very execution focused at Connecterra, not pretty execution focused. And I think that was one of the key drivers for us to land successful fundraise within the pandemic because we have the evidence and the path that we're on. You fuel it, and it continues to grow.
Fantastic. No, go ahead. It sounded like I stopped you in mid-flow then. So,
Uh, well, I think I kind of covered that. I mean, I could go on forever about fundraising and how it's different for different stages and how it's different in the US and Europe. But yeah, you'll have to stop me at some point on that.
of course, and I guess the simple advice, don't fundraise during a pandemic, is probably good advice for anybody. So I guess on the flip side of that, then, what advice would you pass on to other founders from maybe lessons that you've learned, whether they be hard lessons over your experience so far?
Oh, that's a broad question. Um, hmm. Well, I guess I'll start with the top three that come to my mind. And the first one I'd say is raise a bigger seed round. Don't leave money on the table in your early stages. It always takes longer, and you'll always need more money. And I wouldn't worry too much about dilution in your early rounds. And in your seed round, your investor is making a bet on the team, and they're making a bet on the idea. And that is where you have the most freedom to express your vision of the product. Um, and you don't want to compress that because you're going to be short on cash. Once you get customers, then the ball game completely changes because then you're looking at revenues and multiples and so on and so forth. So I'd say bigger seed rounds so you can build a good product is one advice that I'd say. Even though we had a pretty decent seed round, if I look back, I probably would have done a little bit more.
Okay.
Um, the second thing I'd give advice on is everything takes longer in agriculture simply because of the industry. The target customer is not bound to what a lot of other industries are, which is the market and quarterly results and competition. In many cases, if you are farmer focused, or if you're really boots on the ground, um, the sense of urgency is seasonal, um, and you have to go through different seasons and um, different types of environments, and there's really it's going to take you long. So get in for the long ride. If you if you're getting into this space and you like agriculture and you're starting a startup around it, you better really like it, because you'll be doing it for a long time. So don't start something you don't like.
Okay.
It's not a get rich quick scheme by any means. Um, and the third thing that I'd say is, and this has really worked for us, being mission driven and being authentic about your mission. While this sounds a bit fluffy, um, has had huge benefits for us, not just in attracting talent, but as I mentioned earlier, guiding our decision making, and also being able to attract the right type of investors. Um, we truly believe in what we are doing, and we truly see the results of what we are doing. Um, and that is a very gratifying feeling. And being seen as and being recognized for that has really worked for us. It doesn't mean that every mission needs to be um, noble and has to be sustainable and climate, but I've spoken about this in other forums as well. Um, but being mission driven, I think, is going to be the future of companies for the next era to come. And you can't understate the importance of that.
Absolutely. And if we were to take a step back from Connecterra and business in general, where do you see the future of agriculture? What technologies do you think will be driving the change, and what does that look like in your mind?
Uh, um, well, agriculture isn't going away anywhere, right?
Of course.
So it is one of those industries that um, is never going to go away. As long as humans exist, you're going to need food. And the future of if you look at agriculture, if I take the historical context of agriculture, a lot of mechanization. So post World War II, you saw this huge boom in agriculture efficiency that came not just from nitrogen and fertilizers, but also mechanization. And what we're now seeing is that we're going from this macro mechanization of agriculture, where essentially you have these massive combines and tractors and machinery that automated a lot of the labor problems. You're now heading more and more and more towards precision and data-driven agriculture. If you look at what Google's been working in with their moonshot labs at Google X, they call it computational agriculture. If you look at what we're up to with Connecterra, again, it's a form of computational agriculture. So yes, it's going to get data driven, but I think it's going to be more. It's not just data driven, but you're going to be using data to drive action, and you're going to be using those insights to fundamentally change the way we operate. Robotics is on the rise. I think it's going to take some time, but robotics combined with closed environments like what you're seeing with some vertical farms are very interesting technologies coming up. At the same time, we're also seeing um, that within agriculture, there's a lot of innovation that's happening within the biology space of agriculture as well. So you've had GMOs, but now you're looking at some really interesting feed, for instance, for cattle, which is less severe for the climate with lower methane emissions. And I think agriculture is going to intrinsically get linked with climate goals. And the two things are going to go hand in hand. And you're going to have a lot more tech that's going to be used. And finally, what I would add is this may or may not be a good thing for the way you think about it, is you're going to get farms that are going to get bigger. And you're going to get labor that's going to be far more managers of farms who are far more tech savvy than they've ever been. This is an industry that hasn't been digitized and automated, and its time has come.
No, I agree, and I think that we're seeing that with lots of our clients. Obviously, we love the work that you guys do at Connecterra. We work with people in the robotics space, as our listeners will know if they listen to episode 1. We work with people in the biological space if our listeners listen to episode 2. So it's something that we're seeing as well, and I think it can only be a positive both for agriculture and the climate, really.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess from me, thank you so much for your time, Yasir, and thank everyone for listening. And we hope you found this really interesting. If you could rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast, that would be brilliant. Plus, please do listen to episode 1 and 2, as I mentioned. Yasir, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure. And
likewise.
I hope you have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Take care, Steve.